I'm recording this on December 3rd. December 3 marks the anniversary of the Bhopal chemical spill catastrophe in India. Bhopal is a city in central India. In late 1984, chemicals in large quantities spilled out of an industrial plant there, killing, maiming, and damaging tens of thousands of people. The long-term estimated death toll from the 1984 disaster is about 16,000 people, and that makes it the worst human-caused environmental disaster in history. Now, to put that death toll in context, consider some deaths caused by industrial accidents, by nuclear power, just in that subsector. Many people, environmentalists and others, have great fears about nuclear power and remind us of the nuclear accidents at Chernobyl, Soviet Union, Fukushima, Japan, and 3 Mile Island here in the United States. Now, the death toll from the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster is about 4,000 people. The death toll from the 2011 Fukushima nuclear radiation leak is 0. And the death toll from the 1979 3 Mile Island accident, also a nuclear meltdown, is also 0. By that criterion, the Bhopal disaster is 4 times worse than all of the major nuclear accidents combined. Now, in the high-tech society that we strive to be, it is essential that we learn the causes of disasters so that we can correct our mistakes. Technology does lessen many of life's risks, but handled badly, of course, it can add other serious risks. So, Bhopal is rightly a major case to learn from. A hazardous chemical, methyl isocyanate, or otherwise known as, abbreviated as MIC. It's used in the making of agricultural pesticides. MIC was spilled, and tragically, many thousands died or were maimed. The argument I'm going to make is this: Bhopal is the quintessential case of a mixed economy corporate disaster, but especially it is a case of Indian-style socialism in disastrous practice. And I'm going to use Bhopal to suggest a more general lesson, of which Bhopal is a perfect example. That general lesson is this: the worst environmental disasters are in government-controlled economies, with concentrated power, with unaccountable or minimally accountable politicians and bureaucrats calling the shots. That's not an accident. By contrast, the cleanest and the safest environments in the world are places where there are private property rights and the profit motive, that is to say, freedom and capitalism, are the best friends of those of us who care about a clean and beautiful environment. Now, this is very counterintuitive to much of mainstream environmental thinking, and that's why we need particular cases like Bhopal and more general principles extracted from them in other cases. The point is that property rights give you protection against your neighbors who pollute. And the profit motive also gives you an incentive not only to avoid lawsuits from those whom you might harm, but to use resources in the most efficient, least wasteful way. Governments, especially socialist ones, they do away with those checks on power. They don't operate on property rights. They don't operate according to profit motive. And the historical record is clear that socialist societies are, of course, as we know from other areas, they're abusive of the civil rights of their citizens. They are terribly economically inefficient. But we need to make it better known that they are also debasers of their environments. Now, that's very much not the standard story that we hear from environmentalists of a certain sort. Most reflections on Bhopal demonstrate a very partial understanding, or in some cases worse, an ideologically driven blindness to the key parts of the causal story. Now, the sloppy journalistic accounts of Bhopal, and there are many of them, they run this narrative. So here it is. In the name of profit, a large American multinational corporation neglected safety. As a result, many people, especially poorer brown people, were killed and damaged, and the corporate executives involved have never been criminally prosecuted. Now, such accounts typically end with a call for further reparations and legal action in the name of justice. Now, I agree 100% that justice is still absolutely needed in the Bhopal case. But what is needed first is professional investigative reporting of a higher quality. And what is needed also to work with that better journalism is better philosophy, and a rejection of a standard and kind of environmental philosophy that pits economic values of property, rights, profit, and freedom against environmental values of cleanliness and beauty. Better philosophy will integrate. If you want a clean environment, you want a beautiful environment, what you want is a regime that is based on property rights, freedom, and the profit motive. Now, let's look at the Bhopal case to show how it works out.
Join Professor Stephen Hicks on his Adventures in Postmodernism tour next March in Australia, where he'll be giving you his insights and lessons on the subject firsthand. Find out what makes postmodernism attractive. Why is it so dangerous? How has it evolved or mutated over the years? Does postmodernism have strong connections to neo-Marxism? What is the role of it in cultural wars, campus battles over free speech, political correctness, intellectual diversity, identity politics, and the rise of Antifa and alternative right? What other political movements are now adopting postmodernism strategies, and how do we resolve these issues of postmodernism? Stephen Hicks will be appearing in 4 major Australian cities throughout March 2019. He'll be doing an evening talk in Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide and Brisbane starting at 7 p.m, and will be holding an all-day special event masterclass series starting at 9 a.m. on March 10th in Melbourne and March 16th in Sydney, where he will delve even deeper into understanding postmodernism, its history, and teach you valuable strategies to actually combat it. For full details and to reserve your tickets today, go to truearrowevents.com. Select the event to which you would like to attend, and if you hurry, you may even be lucky enough to get your tickets at early bird prices at a 50% discount. And while you're in line, please leave us a review for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
So to start here, I want to just work my way through 8 more journalistic factors, historical factors that are absolutely relevant to determining causation and judging responsibility for the disaster. And basically all 8 of these factors are important, but they are neglected in the standard journalistic accounts that one will read about Bhopal. First, Union Carbide, UCC for short. That was the American corporation that had majority ownership of the industrial plant in Bhopal, India. But Union Carbide's presence in India was governed very heavily by the Indian government and the then very aggressive top-down industrial policy that India was pursuing. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and her Indian National Congress Party, they had long dominated Indian politics. They'd been pursuing explicitly a socialist economic philosophy. For example, in 1969, this is in the lead up to the development of the Bhopal plant, many major banks were nationalized by the government. India's overall economic performance had been consistently very poor under the INC's socialistic policies. This contributed to a lot of political unrest. Ms. Gandhi and her party followers and party members, they frequently asserted that the reason why India was doing so poorly economically had nothing to do with their socialistic policies, but rather it was a matter of foreign conspiracies, a lot of them led by the CIA, that the CIA was at work to undermine her regime, and that Gandhi's government fought the unrest vigorously, partly appealing to these conspiratorial themes and then adopting various internal repressive measures. For example, in the years leading up to the Bhopal disaster, now we're getting into the 70s. This is a decade that is sometimes called India's dark chapter. The nation suffered from rigged elections. Lots of unrest. How do you deal with the unrest? Well, you don't let the democratic process put you out of power. You rig the elections, and you being in power, you're in a position of doing so. In 1975, Ms. Gandhi was convicted by India's High Court of electoral corruption, and they were prohibited from running for public office for 6 years. Ms. Gandhi's response was to declare a state of emergency, and they imposed martial law. They censored the press. They initiated a series of mass arrests of their political opponents, putting them in prison without trial, and they continued the rampant cronyism and corruption. And they took steps to further concentrate political hands in the power of the ruling party under Ms. Gandhi. Thus, from 1975 to 1975, this is at the height of the planning period for the plant that was going to be built in Bhopal, martial law was in place over India, and there was a 21-month suspension of democracy. All right, now that's the political background and the political context within which the Bhopal plant is going to be developed. Now here's a second point. UCC, Union Carbide, they were operating in India for about 40 years at this point, but through a subsidiary. This is Union Carbide India Limited, UCIL. And in keeping with India's changing political environment, this new plant to be constructed in Bhopal was supposed to be a model of a new kind of business-government partnership, a so-called third way between more totalitarian versions of socialism and free market capitalism at the other end of the spectrum. So even so, in 1969, UCIL proposed building this new chemical plant. We're going to manufacture some agricultural pesticides. Its initial plan was to import into India already combined hazardous chemicals. And what they wanted to do in India was only to process some diluted and more safe pesticides, because the American company was making a judgment about the overall technical competence in India at the time. And having made that judgment, UCIL, the American parent company back home, over UCIL rather, judged that importing the chemicals would be a lot safer and a lot less expensive. But the Indian government overrode that decision. It wanted UCIL to manufacture the pesticides from scratch. Now, the reason for this was that the Indian government was pursuing a policy of national self-sufficiency, and they wanted everything, as they put it, to be Indianized. They wanted more foreign high technology to be brought into India. They wanted to have more Indians trained in how to use it. And in the case of the agricultural pesticides that UCIL planned to make here, this would require the storage and the handling of large amounts of hazardous MIC at Bhopal. Just to add another factor here, Bhopal was the capital city of one of the most economically backward states then and even now, Madhya Pradesh. Third, another complicating factor was that in 1974, again, as this Bhopal plant is being planned, the government of India had launched its so-called Foreign Equity Regulation Act. And this statute required that no foreign company could own more than 40% of an Indian company. And so this put us in conflict with UCC, Union Carbide, the American plant, because Union Carbide did not want to reduce its share to that low amount. So this led to a certain amount of conflict, a certain amount of wheeling, dealing back and forth, right? UCC is then saying, well, we want majority ownership and control. Indian government saying, no, we are not going to give you control, but we at the same time still want your technology and your foreign capital. So a deal ended up being worked out. The Indian government did give UCC an exception, the new statute, the Foreign Equity Regulation Act, and it said, okay, we're going to allow you to own 50.9% of UCIL. And then UCC agreed to have UCIL produce the hazardous chemical MIC in India from scratch. And then various Indian government-controlled entities were going to own the other 49.1% of the UCIL corporation. A fourth journalistic element here, part of the historical background, real estate, also part of the deal. The land that the chemical plant was built upon was owned by the Indian government state of Madhya Pradesh. And as part of the overall deal, UCIL, the corporation, jointly owned by Union Carbide and the Indian governments, they would lease land from the state government. A fifth background point. For the design of the plant, all of the industrial systems and so forth, the parent corporation, UCC, the American corporation, was allowed only to use its engineers to submit very generalized guidelines for the design of the safety systems. Again, in the name of Indian national self-sufficiency, the government wanted only Indian consulting firms to make the detailed designs and Indian firms to do all of the installations of them. A sixth point, as regards to who is going to manage and operate the industrial chemical plant. Now we turn to affirmative action and its elevation of race and ethnicity over expertise, accomplishment, and other qualities. Keep in mind, of course, we are building a high-tech, engineering-intensive hazardous chemicals plant, but all of the governments at various levels of Indian society, national level, state level, and local level, pursuing very vigorous affirmative action programs. And the effect of all of these affirmative action programs was to replace UCC's foreign experts in engineering, in chemistry, in management, with, in many cases, untrained or semi-trained locals, with utter disregard for the expertise necessary to manage the plant safely in some cases. And unsurprisingly, many of the beneficiaries of these affirmative action programs were undereducated, undertrained, and many just happened to be family members and friends of the various Indian government officials who were in charge of regulating the facility. A seventh point. Then there's the decision to locate the Bhopal chemical plant right in the middle of a residential community and near a major transportation hub. Who made that decision? Well, it was made by the Indian government. And the local government was actually actively encouraging more people to move there to live right by the chemical plant. It was pursuing a rezoning policy, which included giving thousands of Indians construction loans to incentivize them to build their homes near the chemical plant. And here's an eighth journalistic point to consider before we do some analysis. This eighth point is that the American corporation, Union Carbide, also operated a sister plant in the town of Institute, West Virginia, back in the United States. And it also produced the identical chemical MIC. At the American plant, all safety systems were installed. They were automated, and they were monitored at the highest engineering levels. Any failing parts were replaced regularly, safety audits conducted on time and vigorously, and the audit's recommendations were followed. But not in India. In both cases, we have the same parent company and the same general technology involved, but one chemical plant ran efficiently and safely. That's the one in the United States. The other was a disaster. That's the one in India.
In Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining postmodernism, skepticism, and socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, he writes an incredibly crafted and well-argued insight into what postmodernism is, why it exists, and why it is dangerous applied in the wrong dose, in the wrong place, as it frequently is in this day and age. Postmodernism has been the most vigorous intellectual movement of the late 20th century. In his book, Hicks traces the roots of postmodernism all the way back to the Enlightenment era, where he systematically charts how the Age of Reason sowed the seeds of unreason that was to follow, making a clear connection between postmodernism to history, leftist politics, and even the ugliness of contemporary art. Hicks presents his thesis with beautiful, easy-to-understand explanations that burn with logic and common sense. So if you've ever wondered why society holds so many assumptions about the world, and you want to understand the chaos of what is happening, Hicks's work in this book provides a huge piece to this puzzle. Why do skeptical and relativistic arguments have such power in the contemporary intellectual world? Why do they have that power in the humanities but not in the sciences? Why is a significant portion of the political left the same left that traditionally promoted reason, science, equality for all, and optimism now switch to the themes of anti-reason, anti-science, double standards and cynicism? This book is by far the most helpful resource I've ever come across for understanding why the world is turning into a direction that I just can't comprehend. Pick up your copy of Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism, and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, available now on Amazon.com. While you're online, make sure to subscribe to the Open College podcast, hosted by Stephen Hicks himself, and please leave a review for it on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
To integrate the 8 points, in my view, Bhopal is a classic case of a mixed economy business-government partnership in the context of an overall socialist industrial policy. In such a corrupted business politics environment, disasters are inevitable. And then that's exactly what happened in Bhopal. But then, of course, we also know, when we put our jaded, cynical, political hats on, what happens when a disaster happens? Well, we need scapegoats. Who's going to get thrown to the ideological wolves? Who's going to lose in the cover-your-ass legal scramble? And that's unfortunately what has happened in India. A whole lot of scapegoating, a whole lot of ideological misreadings of the situation, and a lot of cover your ass. But we really need to do better than scapegoating and ass covering. Bhopal is a hugely important case for us to learn from all over the world. And it's absolutely crucial that we attend to all of the relevant factors. And many of them are just omitted in the standard journalistic accounts, particularly the ones that I have read. I mentioned there are some exceptions. Those are worth paying attention to. Kudos to those who were doing the good investigation, but they were a tiny number of minority voices often swept away. Now, here are the questions that I have. When both business and government parties are intimately involved, we need to be able to apportion causal responsibility to both parties. So here are 4 questions that I think we really should be asking. To what extent was Bhopal a corporate failure, and to what extent was it a government failure? Second, does the Bhopal disaster indict the particular business executives who were involved, or the government bureaucrats and politicians who were involved? Was the disaster at Bhopal the result of the immoral pursuit of profit, or was it the result of immoral racial and ethnic quotas under affirmative action? More generally, is capitalism or socialist industrial policy at fault? Now, in my judgment, all of the major parties involved were and are culpable. Should we blame the United States-based United Carbide executives for being willing to do business in such a corrupted foreign environment? Yes, indeed. If you get in bed with corrupt governments, you deserve some of the blame. Do we blame the local UCIL management with its mix of Indian and foreign managers and technicians for gross incompetence and negligence? Absolutely, we should, definitely. Should we blame the Indian governments for consistently putting politics, including affirmative action, above safety and any sort of economic rationality? Yes, absolutely. And then, can we say who is most to blame, since everybody involved was to blame? And here I would say, yes, absolutely, we can here. And here the important point in apportioning blame is this: the party with the most power is always most responsible for how that power is used. Now, at this point, somewhat anachronistically, but I'm reminded of the fictional series House of Cards, very popular in Britain in one version, and then in the United States, an American version. And one of its actually very good lessons about the differences between economic power and political power. And obviously, the United States, rather the United Carbide Corporation, has a significant amount of economic power, but the various Indian governments have a huge amount of political power. Now, to come back to House of Cards, in the American version, the very jaded, power-hungry politician, Francis Underwood, is having a conversation with one of his billionaire business colleagues, and they're having a disagreement, and there's some threats being exchanged. But the politician in this case, Frank Underwood, makes clear that money, the billions that this guy has, is a form of power, but that private wealth is relatively insignificant compared to the power that politicians wield with their ability to tax an entire nation and to mobilize the police and the military. Here's a direct quotation from the character Frank Underwood. Add up all your billions together, and you get the GDP of Slovakia. I have the federal government of the United States. Your money doesn't intimidate me. The most that you can buy is influence, but I wield constitutional authority. You may have all the money, Raymond, but I have all the men with guns. And so in India, who has the guns? In any business-government interaction, it is the government that has the power of police and the military at its disposal. In Bhopal, the business corporation was responsible for how it used its lesser amount of power. It did not pull out of a corrupt deal when it should have. But the various Indian governments were the major powers in the series of so-called negotiated compromises and evasions that led to the Bhopal chemical disaster. And in addition to that political lesson, for those of us who are not politicians, there is an important journalistic lesson from Bhopal for all citizens and all policy and analysts in our high-tech world. Now, there are exceptions in the Bhopal journalism again, but we need to become more professional about serious investigation and analysis. Don't fall for the easy narratives, the easy templates. The stakes are too high. Do some research work. And to repeat, the lesson of which the Bhopal here is an example. The worst environmental disasters are in government-controlled economies, with concentrated powers, unaccountable, minimally accountable politicians and bureaucrats calling the shots. It's not an accident. By contrast, the cleanest and safest environments are places in the world where there are private property rights and the profit motive. Property rights give you protection against your neighbors who might pollute. The profit motive gives you an incentive not only to avoid lawsuits against those you might harm by your pollution or waste products, but they also give you an incentive to use resources in the least efficient, least wasteful way. That's not what happened in Bhopal. When industrial accidents happen on private property and in businesses that are operated by private firms, responsibility is much easier to assign, as is liability, and courts can and regularly do sort out damages. By contrast, governments, especially socialist governments with all of their concentrated power, they do away with those checks on power. And while it's widely known that socialist economies are typically abusive of the civil rights of their citizens, it's widely known that socialist economies are economically inefficient, causing poverty. It's much less well known that their track record is one of debasing their environments and getting away with it. Look at the socialist nations, look at their environmental policies. Bhopal is one of a long list. In the case of Bhopal, hundreds and thousands of politicians and government officials, they made policies, they made deals, and those policies and deals led to the deaths of thousands of people. Not a single one of them has been held responsible, sued, or otherwise punished. And that is a profound irresponsibility. And by way of internal advertisement for this series, for another case of government-caused environmental disaster, please see the episode on the Love Canal, New York chemical spill case.
The host of the Open College podcast, Dr. Stephen Hicks, is a renowned philosopher and author. His field of study and insights into postmodernism explain how it has become one of the most powerful intellectual movements of our time, and what that actually means. If you'd like to access more information from Dr. Hicks himself, then check out his website at www.stephenhicks.org. You'll be able to find details on his latest publications, courses, and philosophical information concerning business ethics, education, intellectual history, and religion. To stay up to date with the latest from Stephen Hicks himself, make sure you've subscribed to the Open College Podcast feed and follow at Open College Podcast on all your favourite social networks. And while you're online, please leave the show a review on iTunes and Stitcher.